I'm Shannon Caine. Welcome to the Caine Interviews. Today we'll be talking with 4 individuals from the OTO, an organization devoted to ceremonial magic. We'll be discussing ceremonial magic, occultism, and the OTO. We may also address some common misconceptions regarding ceremonial magic and about the occult in general. With me today is Mikkel Taylor, Brandon Williams, Kevin Regier, and Don Lee. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, you're ceremonial magicians. However, many occult practitioners in this area are Wiccans. So, how does ceremonial magic differ from Wicca, from paganism?
The terms occult and ceremonial magic are relatively new. They're pretty much out of the 19th century, are now being used to designate a certain style of working from other styles of working within the field. Both Wicca and ceremonial magic come out of what is called the Western mystery tradition or the Western esoteric tradition. And this tradition has been developing for thousands of years through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through Romanticism, and now in modern times has been carried a step further into, what's being called paganism, which is a revival of earth spirituality and interest in pre-Christian religions. Ceremonial magic itself can differ in terms of the theology behind it. It does not have, Wicca comes after ceremonial magic, basically. It's the newest development in the whole lineage. So they have a certain format spiritually that doesn't really apply. It can apply. They can be, depending on the practitioner, they can be very related or even the same thing. But there's not the limitations of, say, a god and a goddess. Wicca also tends to throw out the influence of Judaism, the influence of Christianity, which ceremonial magic doesn't. It still uses a lot of the terminology and the symbolism and even a lot of the theology that was found in Christianity.
Okay.
I would like to add to that.
Please do.
Another major difference, primarily ceremonial magic usually happens inside of a building, like a temple or a room in someone's house or whatever, whereas a lot of the time with Wicca, they go out to the forest or go outside to do their practices.
Okay. Could you briefly explain for us the terms high magic and low magic?
Well, the terms high magic and low magic kind of come from, some people say, the fact that what's called high magic or ceremonial magic was primarily done in the cities, as I said earlier, in temples and whatnot, whereas low magic was performed in the country and it was more geared towards crop production, fertility of their livestock, and that sort of thing. Also, the kind of another way of looking at it is the Greek words theurgy and thaumaturgy. Theurgy, or high magic, is more or less about union of yourself with God by whatever definition you want to give to that, whereas low magic or thaumaturgy is geared more towards spell work, causing some sort of effect on the physical world.
Okay. I'll ask Kevin this next one. When one encounters books about ceremonial magic, the word magic is always spelled with a K on the end. Why is that?
For the most part, the reason is to differentiate between like stage magic and just general like prestidigitation, so you don't get any mix-ups through that kind of magic and quote-unquote real magic, which is ceremonial magic.
Okay. Can one be a solitary practitioner of ceremonial magic, or is it really preferable that the work be undertaken in a group setting such as the OTO?
Most people, I think, probably are solitary practitioners. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you would find that number out, but it certainly is. It speeds you along in your progress if you're around other people, as in any endeavor. If you're around other people that are interested in similar things, and you don't reinvent the wheel over and over and over, by, buying a book and thinking about it for 10 years. If you're actually around other people that do it, thinking, well, you need to read this, you shouldn't read that, that's. And so if you are able to do that, you should probably find other people, just for social reasons, if for no other reason. Yeah, it helps.
Okay.
There's also, I think that ideally it would be a blend of both, because there will always, for one thing, especially in the way we approach it, the object of what we do is spiritual enlightenment. It is a very deeply personal thing. There are going to be things that you need to work on that you might not feel comfortable working on in a group. So in the end, it has to be really between you and the divine, and that's going to demand individual work. But like you said, learning the intricacies and also having the stabilizing influence of other people to not get isolated in your search, it's good to have a group.
Okay.
It's like writing. Writing and magic are a lot alike. I mean, it's a solitary activity, really. But once you've done the thing that you're doing, it really helps to have other people around.
Sure, and so as a writer, one would tend to congregate and just naturally congregate with other writers.
Sure, you get tired of sitting around by yourself all the
Magicians,
time.
draw the
Yeah.
magicians.
Exactly.
Okay, super. Well, could you give us a little background on the OTO? Also, who is Aleister Crowley, and what importance does he have within your own magical tradition?
Well, the OTO was started in 1895 by Dr. Theodore Royce, and it was a branch off of Freemasonry at the time, and a lot of the time Freemasons were allowed within the OTO to a corresponding degree, but we have since quit that practice. And it flourished in the early 1900s until about the 1950s or 1960s. The numbers dropped drastically and they revived in the 60s and 70s. Aleister Crowley entered the OTO in about 1923 or so and pretty much redefined the mystery of the OTO, redefined the terminology and a lot of the ceremonies we do.
In terms of who he was, it's really important to understand the environment that he was coming out of. He was raised Plymouth Brethren. He had a strong backlash against kind of what he saw as a very oppressive form of Christianity, a very fundamentalist type mindset, and also his society in the time. He was a artist, he was a writer, he was a poet. He considered himself probably a better poet than what the rest of us do, but he was very involved in the intellectual scene of that time. He was at times frequented Rodin's salon, and so there was all this, just wealth of ideas there. What he brought into it was this symbolic tradition. He was very interested in alchemy and the Rosicrucian mysteries and this idea of the Western tradition. And when he got a hold of it and he started learning about it, of course he started having his own ideas. They turned out to be pretty radical. He had his own kind of revelation towards it and added that to the mix.
Including yoga.
Yes, bringing over the influence of the Eastern traditions also.
Now, some people erroneously equate ceremonial magic and, in fact, all occult work with Satanism, but there's no real correlation between Satanism and ceremonial magic, is there?
No, I mean, not at all. There are a couple of kinds of Satanism, maybe more than two, but I mean, Satanism is either a sort of, what would you say, early Darwinian sort of humanistic. Satan is a metaphor for the rebel in culture, and to be that sort of Satanist, which is sort of a LaVey, anti-LaVey, Church of Satan kind of Satanist, is not, doesn't involve necessarily magic at all. There's no it's elitist, okay, for one thing. But then there's the other people who actually sort of like consider Satan a metaphysical entity and worship him, and that's a strand. And then there's sort of like reverse Christians. I sort of always think of them as people who sort of never got over shocking their parents or wanting to shock their parents, so that they dress like black, much like we are, and do this a lot, and shock everybody that they possibly can. But none of those things have anything to do per se with ceremonial magic. In fact, there's a huge Christian element in magic that goes back to the beginning of Christianity and the beginning of magic?
Because that there can be a mysticism even associated with Satanism. A lot of people identify with that as the primal self, or with the with something that they want to identify with. In that case, they may use ceremonial magic as part of the language that they develop to get there. There's really, in that sense, ceremonial magic becomes just a technique or a way of working that people can use. As far as the theology being the same, of course, it's radically different. But
now, LaVey had a book, The Satanic Rituals. Would you say that, because it is a set of rituals, would you say that in some loose sense it might be a form of ceremonial magic?
I think it's certainly meant to be, and I've always wondered, and I would be curious to know what everyone else thought about the fact that LaVeyan Satanism is given us this like humanistic philosophy. The same book has all these rituals in it. I mean, how do those things go together?
Well, I think Anton LaVey saw ceremonial magic as a useful tool in that he believed that the performance of a ritual, which I think he's right in this case, the performance of a ritual brings you into focus to where you can, if nothing else, psychologically train yourself to make something happen.
and it's a way, like we were saying, everybody took the tradition in a different way. You had Gardner taking it into Wicca, and L. Ron Hubbard taking it into Scientology, and LaVey taking it into Satanism. The main thing with LaVey is that, in relation to us, is that he was very influenced by his interpretation of Aleister Crowley's work. Fortunately, many of us think that he had the wrong idea. He took Crowley's idea of do what thou wilt, which is expressly in Crowley's writing, said it is not do what you want. It is understanding that you have a true will, a purpose, a divine purpose, and it's learning that and then doing that. LaVey said no, it's do what you want, and he kind of took it into his own. He didn't tell people at the time. There wasn't a lot of interest in Aleister Crowley, and there wasn't a lot of reading of the original text, so he got away with a lot. And so there are people who will say, oh yeah, Satanism is just a form of ceremonial magic.
But back to the do what thou wilt concept, the concept of the will figures very prominently in ceremonial magic, right?
Sure.
Especially in the lema, which is the Greek word for will, and that is the style that Crowley developed.
The three legs of magic are the three parts of it are the will, the imagination, and desire, emotion, desire. I mean, those are equal legs on the tripod, I guess.
Okay. Let me ask about chaos magic. What is chaos magic, and is it compatible with ceremonial magic?
Chaos magic is pretty much the idea of breaking down all of the frameworks that are imposed on magic, like the Kabbalah, which we'll discuss in a second. And any sort of magic or mysticism you can think of, it's breaking those down and just working with the primal energies. And then it's also, you can take stuff from like the Kabbalah and from other forms of Christian mysticism and other forms of ceremonial magic and kind of make your own system out of it, make your own tradition out of it. So it's also a very individual practice. And it's compatible with ceremonial magic in the way that you can take parts of ceremonial magic and work it into chaos magic, even going so far as to do ceremonial magic rituals with chaos magic terms and stuff.
Is it fair to say that chaos magic is like the garage band form of magic?
Yes,
I mean, it
yes.
is. You don't have to like be a great musician. You just have to like you buy a guitar and start playing it.
So it's more of the do-it-yourself indie movement.
Yeah, it's
Right.
it's a very free-form philosophy of viewing everything.
But yet it is disciplined in a
Oh,
sense among the
definitely.
better magicians.
Yes,
that
yes,
I've
it's
read.
very, it's very disciplined.
It's very influenced by staying up to date with science, as is most people I know in ceremonial magic. We don't want to be repeating stuff that became outdated in the 16th century. So chaos magic often looks at just pure science theory and is an attempt to, like in science, to break things down into formulas and equations and to just work with the raw elements.
So chaos magic might even afford you the chance to incorporate postmodern
Oh,
paradigms.
definitely.
Yeah,
Very
Definitely.
much so.
And there's a lot of like theoretical physics and mathematics and stuff like that. One of the prominent chaos magic authors, Peter J. Carroll, actually has like the equations of magic that are really high level algebraic formulas to figure out magic stuff.
Aside from Aleister Crowley, who are some other important figures within ceremonial magic?
Oh, well, gosh. Austin Osman Spare is the father of chaos magic. He's someone that, who are some other names? Peter J. Carroll, Phil Hine.
Eliphas Levi.
Levy. Levy was the 19th century.
Lon Milo Ducat.
Yeah,
Lon
You
Milo-
gotta think of modern people too.
Gerald Ocampo.
Franz Barden is important. John Dee. This is back in the more historical.
Lon Duquette's
category.
coming here in March and giving a lecture and going to be signing books in town. So, and he's
Yeah.
got great books that are really funny, and he's a good writer.
There's so many. I mean, you deal with how many things have been written about it over 2,000 years.
And then if you go and you explore the internet on the subject, then you
Sure.
stumble across just a huge resource of.
A side question. Is there anybody that seems to be lumped in with ceremonial magic that might be avoided?
People not to read.
Oh.
I would get really catty if I answered that, but
Yeah.
there's certain authors that really trivialize things and
Example.
okay.
Just one.
I have to say it. I don't like Donald Tyson. I think
Okay.
that his approach to a good writer will respect the tradition and will try to present his take on it. It's like you're staying with the discourse. You present your take on it, but you don't try to just, take your interpretation of the tradition and make the tradition that. You always take what you're doing and you relate it back to the tradition so that you always present something that's rich and varied. And a lot of writers come up with an interpretation and then they try to sell that interpretation. I don't like that.
I'd also like to bring up that there are a lot of conspiracy theorists out there, such as David Icke, for instance, P.R. Koenig, and what was that? Oh, G.M. Kelly.
Yeah.
Them two you'll see on the internet, but a lot of there are people out there that are just out to bash somebody because they're mad at the world or something.
So you mentioned conspiracy theorists. Is there a lot of confusion with, say, lumping ceremonial magicians, or the OTO specifically, in with some Illuminati conspiracy?
Yes, that happens a lot of the time, and the fact of the matter is, at least as far as I know anyway, the large majority of us are regular, normal people. We have jobs, families, homes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have no allegiance with like a World Bank or something like that.
Yeah.
It'd be
You
nice.
are not part of the Trilateral Commission.
The
No.
truth is so much less interesting
Right.
than the image. But yeah, there are a lot of people that I'm not saying that there's not. I think that probably if there is a great power running the world, it's not concerned with 17th and 18th century esoteric ideas. I think they're a little bit more focused on something material like cash or banking or something. We're not. We're people who read a lot of really old and really wordy books.
They asked Lon Duquette if he was in the Illuminati on the radio, and he said, well, no. And he went into this long explanation of how most organizations can't even get together to have a picnic after work, much less to run the world. He said, of course, if I was in the Illuminati, that's exactly the sort of answer I would give you.
Yeah.
So, so yeah.
So it's kind of open. So, okay. Well,
If we were, we wouldn't tell you.
Okay.
You see how well organized we are.
Oh, yeah. Well, on shortwave radio, just recently, I was hearing somebody lumping in ceremonial magic with the Illuminati in general, the Rosicrucians, and Aleister Crowley, the Satanist.
Yeah.
And so it's, you know,
Can I
and I've heard over and over radio and TV preachers saying that Crowley was a Satanist, which we've now already established is absurd.
I can make a point about that. Crowley loved publicity. I mean,
Right.
he was Victorian, and he'd come from a very straight background, and he was a very outlandish kind of guy, and I think he kind of considered all publicity good in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was on tabloid covers a lot, and he wouldn't have turned down the accusation of being a Satanist just because it was such good publicity. But there's no, there's nothing there about, you know.
Right, so he might from the great beyond almost appreciate.
He was the
that
Ozzy
sort
Osbourne of
thing. Yeah.
1920. Okay, so
I'd also like to bring up that probably most likely, to be perfectly honest, Aleister Crowley was probably way too arrogant to like kneel and worship Satan or anything else
Yeah.
really that much.
That's an important thing. There's the way we approach the idea of Satan in terms of how we look at things. It's an archetype. It's an archetypal energy. The Tree of Life is actually based on arranging, or the Western Tree of Life, arranging archetypal energies into categories.
Mhm.
And each of these categories are natural forces in the world as far as, or are natural aspects of humanity. So there's not any one that we say, okay, that's, you know, when we're talking about them in their positive form, there's not one that we say, oh, that one's, you know, doesn't belong there. The way we look at that energy, which would be corresponding to Capricorn astrologically, or to gods such as Set, Satan, any of the other type of adversarial type figures, is that they just represent the adversary. They represent the challenger. They represent the scapegoat. And a lot of people throughout history, not only Crowley, but the Hellfire Club, a lot of thinkers of the time, Gurdjieff, like to take that and say that scapegoat that people are being afraid of, it's just a shadow. It's just
it's a part
a
of you.
boogeyman. So let's confront it. And they would confront it often by saying, I'm going to, you know, hey, this is part of me. This is who I am, or this is what I'm about. And seeing how people reacted to it.
Right.
Another point about the whole thing about Satanism and Christianity versus magic, ceremonial magic. My friend John Hanley in New Jersey, who runs the camp in Bayonne, New Jersey, said, you know, when you get right down to it, it's all about getting right with God, which is such a thing you would not expect a magician to say. But the Tree of Life, you're at the bottom and God's at the top, and you're supposed to go to the top. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of any of this stuff, is to work out this relationship with God, and the rest, the side stuff is side stuff.
Okay. How difficult is it to be a ceremonial magician? Can just anyone walk up and do it, or does it require intensive study?
It requires a great deal of study and practice, but in the beginning particularly, it's a lot easier than most people would think. You know, first of all, you know, when, say for instance, learning baseball, you're not going to hit the ball the first time every time when you're learning to play baseball. And the same's true when learning ceremonial magic. You can flub a ritual, but there are always shortcuts and little ways of learning it, and practice naturally.
Technique-wise, if you have something that you want to do and you have a love for it, and you're willing to undertake the discipline, the patience, the study, the repetitiveness, and have the natural talent in terms of just being physically able to do it or mentally able to do it, you know, it's just like anything else. It's acquiring a skill. As far as dealing with kind of the culture around it, I think that it kind of takes a special person. You know, there's people can be great magicians and absolutely never think of themselves as a magician. In fact, I have friends who are architects that I consider far better magicians than I'll ever be. It's just, to me, their form of magic. But as far as being able to keep focused on that when you're exploring all of this other stuff, you're reading a lot, you got to really have a love for it. A lot of people expect it to be easy, And of course it's not. If actually controlling your life was easy, we would all be thin, rich, and happy. And life is much harder than that. So
once again, it comes down to the will.
yeah,
Love and will.
right.
Okay. Can one be a successful magician and be a Christian?
Definitely. For most, up until probably the past 100 years, the entire tradition was couched in Christian terminology. It used Christian symbolism. It developed the ideas and the thinking of mystics, from throughout all of Christianity. A lot of this is based on Gnosticism, and so it has a Christian, for those of us who consider Gnosticism Christian also, it has a Christian undertone. It also looks at the Neoplatonic schools and the old pagan mystery traditions, Egypt, places like that. So it incorporates both paganism and Christianity. But there are people who, there's an author here locally in the state, Ambrose Hawk. He's a practicing Catholic. He's also an expert on ceremonial magic and a teacher of how the two relate. He sees it as just a natural part of the actual way that you practice talking with God.
Okay.
It's kind of something you see, particularly in the older grimoires. You have this period of preparation before you actually undergo a ceremony, and repeatedly in the what you would call the preliminary prayers or invocations, you see a lot in the name of the Lord Jesus, Amen, and whatnot, and so on and so forth. Even in the so-called black magic grimoires involving calling up theoretically demons or whatever, you still have this preparation and these prayers to God and Jesus and angels and saints.
It's
and
because
whatever.
there's a continuum, and you're in the middle, and the demons or whatever are below you, and the angels are above, and God's at the top. And if you're a learned person, then you have a relationship with that entire spectrum.
Now, most ceremonial magicians have a working knowledge of Hebrew, and they also work with the Tree of Life. Would you say that there's a connection between magic and Judaism?
That's up to the individual magician. If the individual magician is into, having bar mitzvahs, et cetera, conventional Judaism, he or she is more welcome to. But it's not absolutely necessary. And also, for instance, the Tree of Life glyph, that's not the particular Judaic version of it. That's the Western ceremonial tradition version of it. And we have our own take on that particular mysticism, but it's not the same as Judaism, always.
And that's an area where the influence of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, the rabbinical traditions associated with that, when they started being translated into English, and they kind of fed into the thing that scholarly people and spiritual people were looking at, they became part of the tradition. They have their own separate tradition that is very different from what we do. There's a lot to be learned from comparing the two, and I advocate anybody studying ours to go back and look at the original to understand what its purpose was. But when it became part of the Western tradition, it started going in its own direction. So there is a difference. There's a connection. There's not only Judaism, Arabic, what's some others? Greek,
Yeah.
Buddhist. There's tie-ins from many different world religions. In fact, possibly at this point, if there's a world religion out there that hasn't been looked at and incorporated, or at least elements of it into the Western tradition, I don't know what it is.
Well, one of Crowley's important books is 777, which is an attempt to correlate all those things so that you can look up, a Hebrew letter and find out what it means, that it means hand, and it also means this number, and that it also relates to this I Ching ideogram, and that it also relates to this other thing in Buddhism. I mean, you look across the column and you see what color and what incense, and it's all one thing, and that's one of the things that you do.
Okay. Yeah, compare it's not saying that they are one for one related, But there is a tendency, because we're looking, especially now after postmodernism, we just kind of grab a hold of everything. But there is a tendency to try to look at things in a universal sense and to say, okay, I see this archetypal idea expressed this way in this culture, this way in this culture, and this way in this culture, and to use that as a way of understanding the essence beyond just how it appears in the culture.
On the tree of life, every point and every path have thousands of correlations. You look up that point and it means all these other things.
Okay, let's talk briefly about the evocation of spirits. Can a skilled ceremonial magician actually bring a spirit to visible appearance? And also, what types of spirits might one contact, and why would somebody want to do that?
Well, as far as physically appearing in the sense of, like, you're sitting over there and I'm sitting over here, I've never actually seen that happen. But I was involved in a ceremony some years back where you got the vague outline of something. You couldn't really make it out hardly. We were outside, too, so that made it a little more difficult. But when we were finished talking to the spirit and everything, and we released it, the direction we released it to, it's really amazing. Some dogs ran off barking in that direction. So I believe it's fairly possible with enough skill that a magician could conceivably do that.
Most people, especially since now a lot of people understand these as archetypal energies, most people use things like scrying, which is looking into some sort of a bowl of water or speculum or a crystal ball or something like that, to where you actually don't have to bring something non-material into the material world. A lot of people now use astral travel. They use dreams. They use
Your life becomes a huge coincidence. Everything is coincidental.
synchronicity, things like that. Ways of perceiving that you're having a dialogue with something. As far as the evocation of spirits, usually there's a hierarchy. You would want to balance yourself out. You naturally are composed of energies that, depending on who you are as a person, say you're a very lunar person, you're drawn to, you're very imaginative, you're very inspired, but you don't have a lot of connection when it comes to being, say, a Mars type and getting things done in the real world. So one of the things that you would start doing with evocation is to evoke a spirit of Mars and to start dialoguing with that in order to integrate the energy into who you are and to change yourself. So you start filling yourself out. The practice that most people usually think of is called Goetia, which is where you're summoning what people call demons. They're actually just a lot of times the gods of other cultures that were then considered to be demons or lower energies. Lama Laquette is one who looks at these as just your lower selves. Archetypes that are aligned to lower selves that have the job, if you will, of taking care of life, taking care of the primal needs, things like that. The point in summoning them would be to get them under control, to basically first attach yourself to the higher. That's what the prayers and invocations and preliminary purifications are about. You align yourself to the higher, you try to really feel a connection to your true will, to God, and then you bring these lower things in and you make them swear allegiance to that. So in the long run, it's basically saying, I have to get a job, I have to make money. I want my way of doing that to respect or to reflect my spiritual purpose. So I'm going to say, okay, job spirit. Whatever I do now, I want you to do this, knowing that you're taking orders from me, a spiritual person who expects you to have both the ability to take care of my needs, to bring me money, but you're not just going to be out there running around. You're not going to be overwhelmed by greed anymore. You're actually going to know now, because you've had this dialogue via ritual, that you're doing a job for a purpose, and part of that purpose is spiritual.
Okay. Now, some Wiccans like to differentiate between so-called black magic and white magic. Does your own branch of magic make these distinctions?
Do you want to take that?
The distinction isn't nearly as, shall we say, dogmatic as what the Wiccans have. The distinction between black magic and white magic for Thelema is pretty much white magic is anything that you do that brings you closer to your will, to your knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel, God, whatever, however you want to approach that. And black magic is anything you do that's a deviation from that. For instance, okay, if you cast a spell or whatever to get $500, but $500 isn't going to help you get closer to that. In fact, it'll take you away from it. You become more material. It would qualify as black magic. However, if the $500 helps you, say, pay your bills so you don't have to worry about that or whatever, then in that case it would be white magic. It would be, we're back at the theurgy, thaumaturgy thing.
Okay. Now, what are some of the things that a beginning magician would be required to study?
Oh, gosh. You could probably buy 5 books and have everything you probably really ever need to know about magic. Crowley's Big Blue Book, which is really titled
Liber Abba. It's broken down into book 4, Magic Theory and Practice, and then there's a large edition from Weiser.
Big Blue Book.
It's
$50.
known as Big Blue, but it is his entire teachings, basically the core of his teachings. He wrote many books, but this is the nutshell of what the tradition is as far as when he gets a hold of it.
And then Lon Duquette has books that interpret those books, because you read Crowley and he's trying to pack everything into this document, and so sometimes it's a little hard to read because he tries to make everything really dense and be there. And like someone like Duquette takes it and explains it, and then you understand what he's talking about.
Yeah, there are several magical primers, I guess is what they call them, that are basically out there to put the writings of such people as Aleister Crowley, Eliphas Levi, Mathers. Mathers is really hard to follow sometimes. It takes what these guys say and puts it in plain English.
Partly it's because the books are old. Some of them was written 150 years ago. It's just a little hard to read now anyway. And partly it's because they were trying to get everything in. But Crowley's Big Blue Book, who else? Donald Michael Craig.
I was going to say,
I was
would you
thinking-
recommend the modern magic?
Modern
Definitely.
magic is
Magic,
personally
yeah.
where I started. I know a lot. I'm not going to speak for anybody else here, but I know a lot of people that started out with that.
Good book.
Because it gives you a good foundation of the Kabbalah and mysticism in general.
You would also want to learn as much as you could about comparative religion. Archetypal psychology is something that I study. It's very helpful in the understanding of ceremonial magic for me. Even modern science,
Sure.
Michio Kaku's Hyperspace
Yeah, Hyperspace
is a good book.
Cosmic Trigger by Robert Anton Wilson is a really funny book that about a third of which is devoted to Crowley and magic. That was the first thing I ever read about magic, and it's just a really wonderful book. It's also got stuff about Timothy Leary in it. And anyway, Cosmic Trigger is a good book.
Okay. Well, finally, how does a person really get started as a ceremonial magician? Who would, if a person wanted to get into it, who would they contact? What should they do?
I was in Mexico and I had a dream that I was being initiated into a lodge by Grady McMurtry. I knew who that was in the dream. I'd seen pictures of him. I came back to Arkansas and went into their bookstore and asked them if they heard of Aleister Crowley, and they leaped to their feet and initiated, took me
One
in.
of
And
us,
we
Gabba Gabba Hey.
You know, there are always local magic groups wherever you are. It's what you're into,
For
I
the
guess.
most part, yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing, too, a lot of the times, particularly with the OTO at any rate, if you go out and buy a book, there's a means to contact them in the back of the
Yeah.
book. There's
The
an
web.
address, and
The
also
internet.
there's the internet.
Yeah.
The internet.
Go internet.
Looking at any kind of groups, like Yahoo groups or whatever, you can just find
yeah.
endless amounts, and you can find one that's tailored to kind of what level you are
Yeah.
and the kind of stuff you want to learn.
I would say my advice is always to first of all to read up on things. Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton is one of the best overviews of everything from the beginnings of the tradition to Wicca, modern neo-paganism. It talks a great deal about ceremonial magic. So start looking at that and start going through and saying, okay, well, I know I'm interested in this. I'm not so interested in this. And to just to get on the web, explore, look at some different groups, and figure out which one is actually right for you. Get a basic knowledge. It's very hard when people walk up and they just say, okay, well, teach me about ceremonial magic,
Right.
because by this point you've accumulated so much of a range of what that could include that you just look at them and go, what do you want to know? You know, so have an idea of what your questions are first. That's always helpful, and what you're looking for, and what you're interested in, and what you're not interested in. And
I would say too, for a beginning person, I mean, you have to find a book, let's say, that you like. But unless you want to be an armchair magician for the rest of your life, which I almost did, kind of, you have to trust yourself to actually try some of it and do it. And don't worry about something coming to bite your head off. You're not going to, it's not going to be like that.
I think the fact that all four of us are here will attest to that fact. We've all made mistakes.
Dumb things that you do.
And, the fact that we're here and not locked up in a padded cell or something like that says a lot.
It's okay.
the ultimate perspective I was originally taught on it was that everything that you will encounter is part of yourself, and that you are part of God. And that way, while you may run into some frightening things, we all have nightmares. So we all can generate some pretty frightening things. There's nothing that is just going to, like you said, tear your head off. And I think you should try some of it out, but at the same time, don't just go and find the most hardcore manual out there and try to do that because you think that that's what a real person would do or a hardcore person would do. Take it slow. It's like learning to drive. It's like anything else.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. And we've been talking to Mikhail Taylor, Brandon Williams, Kevin Regier, and Don Lee. For the Caine Interviews, I'm Shannon Caine. Thanks for tuning in.